of late, I've been thinking about language, and Wittgenstein is a philosopher of language. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about language, second languages, native languages, and then kind of talk about my experience as an immigrant, non-native speaker, share some poems from another poet who is in the same position, and a couple of my poems. And then hopefully by the end, it will all come together kind of through some kind of gumbo of poetry. So let me start with two quotes by Wittgenstein. He's of course German, actually Austrian, sorry. Austrian philosopher, died in 1951. And this is a quote that I've thought about for a long time. I quote Wittgenstein. He says, "The limits of my language are the limits of my mind. All I know is what I have words for. The limits of my language are the limits of my mind. All I know is what I have words for." And very quickly, because this can be controversial, I think he's making a distinction between observation and experience. For example, I see an apple fall from a tree. I see that, okay? I perceive it, I understand what's happening. That's one level of experience. And he's separating a different kind of knowledge from that. It's the knowledge of being able to express in an abstract manner what is happening. I can say, okay, what is happening right there is there is a force attracting that apple. That force can be calculated if we take into account the mass of the apple, the mass of the planet Earth, the ratio of their distance, and we can calculate that, and I can tell you exactly how to do it. And not only that, we can send a rocket to the moon, put people on the moon, and bring them back using that knowledge that exists within our capacity to share that language, that knowledge through language. So I know what I can express. And what I can express is the bounds of my language. If I don't have a concept to talk about something, I may know and I might have lived through it, but if I don't have a concept to talk about it, it may not be part of my knowledge. And you could go through trauma and suffer incredibly. And many survivors experience this. It is not until they become aware of the terminology of trauma, how to talk about trauma, that they can then begin to understand and know what they've been through. And it's a very difficult process precisely because of the gap between experience and actually processing it as knowledge. So I hope that's clear enough. And then the second quote from him that I've been drawn to is, it seems like it's completely different. He says, "If we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present." If we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present. Which is, of course, a very Buddhist kind of approach. And it reminds me of another Jewish scholar, Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about how life is suffering, but finding the meaning of life, that's survival, finding meaning in suffering. And he says, how we live my moment, no one can take that away from me. Viktor Frankl says, I was in Auschwitz, in concentration camp, but how I was in that moment, no one could steal from me. I was master of that moment. That was very difficult for me to accept. I really wanted to rebel against that and say, really, seriously, you're saying that you're in Auschwitz and you're going to be in control of your emotions and your perceptions? What if you're a slave? You have nothing to look forward to. Like, you were born in slavery, you know you're going to die in slavery. What is there for the moment? How can you like value the moment? Wouldn't you be like dead? Wouldn't you rather die? When I was young, right? That was my approach. As I've gotten older, I've learned that people do almost anything possible to stay alive, because as long as you're alive, there's a chance that things may change. As long as you're alive, things may change tomorrow. Things may change this afternoon. Auschwitz could get liberated. I may be set free. Civil war could happen and I could be set free. If I'm dead, that's not going to happen. It doesn't exist. So as long as I'm alive, there's a process for change. And being alive involves being alive moment by moment, living in the moment. So let's put those two things aside for a second and consider the possible tension between the two. Knowledge only in language, you have to be, what you know can only be expressed through language, either to yourself or to others, and the timelessness of the moment. When you're in the moment, you're really living in eternity in a way, because you don't consider the past or the future. You're in the moment. Borges says, like immortality, Jorge Luis Borges, the writer, he says, immortality is pretty banal. Immortality is banal. Every animal except man is immortal because they don't know they're going to die. They don't know that the death is coming. They don't understand it. They don't have that knowledge. So what's amazing is to be immortal and know it. That's really the amazing thing. So every animal is immortal. They don't know they're going to die. So there's that tension again between knowledge, what do I know, and then being in the moment. I'm being present, I'm living life as a conscious, aware process. So I became acquainted with this really early on in my life. I was 13 when we came to the United States, and I spoke Spanish. I was born, everyone spoke Spanish. I understood everybody. I took language for granted. Something that happens, is normal, it's natural, people talk. When we came to the United States, we actually ended up encountering, of course, a culture that was predominantly English speaking. And while we did have some translators initially, and some in school, there were people that I could not communicate with at all. I had no way to communicate with them because I spoke Spanish and they spoke English. Mostly I remember my homeroom teacher and my coach, gym coach. Neither one of them spoke English. And so almost immediately I needed help to communicate. Somebody had to come in and translate what I was saying to them and translate what they were saying to me. And it became, immediately you become aware that there is this artificial boundary between us. Language, even, it's hard to pick up when it's your native language. It's just there. It's like water. You're a fish and you're in water. But when you become aware of the process of what's happening, that somebody's saying something, then I am having to translate it to myself, it becomes much more aware that when somebody's having to translate it for you. So language becomes this process that has parts, right? Somebody says something using a particular vocabulary, that you have to hear that, interpret it, process it, and then eventually it gets to where you're drawing meaning. And it's a fairly complicated process. So I was 13, so I became what the field calls a language broker. I began to translate for my parents, my mom, my mother, when they had to go to visit the hospital, my sister again, eventually translate letters the government was sending, translate news in English to them, and TV shows. We would watch TV shows and I would have to explain the jokes. And this was a slow process that there was nobody else. I was the older sibling. The adults weren't quite able, they just weren't flexible enough, I guess, to initiate this on their own. So I kind of stepped in. My sister was 6 at the time. My first cousin was 4, I believe. And I was 13. So I was kind of was pushed into that. And as a language broker, there's a lot of benefits that come from that, because I was forced to learn new vocabulary, interact with people, kind of learn the new culture, read people's languages. So the way people act in Cuba and the way people act in the United States is very different. Body language is very, very different. Cubans are there's a lot of gesturing with your hands when you talk. There's a lot of physical movement that goes on. And in the United States, I immediately noticed that was not the case. People were very, comparatively speaking, they were very poised. They kept neutral body stance. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't gesture a lot with their hands. So it was a different, you start reading those things. And I think that helped me a lot. In fact, there is evidence that shows that language brokers do a lot better academically and have much more sophisticated skills than non-language brokers. And in fact, we came to the United States, and 2 years and 6 months later, when I just started 10th grade, we took what was called the PSAT, the pre-SAT test, which I have no idea what it was, but they gave us this test and I took it. And incredibly, 2.5 years after coming to the US, I scored 99% in the reading percentile and in the 90s in language and reading. I don't remember the language score, but it was in the 90s. And I do remember the 99 percentile because everybody was like, wow, this is like incredible. And it's not because I was all that smart. I mean, I'm pretty smart, you know, but not near genius level or anything like that. It was just, those are the skills you practice. And the skills I learned as I was learning English were how to read, how to understand, how to comprehend, etc. And it's very easy for me to translate now. And I understand now that it's because I got started translating, you know, when I was 13, and the younger you start doing something, the better you eventually get at it. So my ability to translate fairly complex poetry, well, I think, goes back directly to that experience of having to practice those skills early on. So that said, my relationship with language was one that I want. At the same time, I envy native speakers because there's a relationship that native speakers have with the language that I don't have. I can hear it in Spanish. There are sounds that I hear in Spanish, subtleties that I hear that when I speak English or listen to English, it's like there's a conversation going on in the next room and there's like a door that's closed and I can hear it and I can understand, but I feel like I'm missing subtleties. And so, especially when I read the work of people like Frost, W.B.H., Seamus Heaney, Emily Dickinson, their language is so, I envy that ability to just hear the monosyllabic beauty that is English. You know, just the syllables are so powerful. So on the one hand, I envy native speakers. On the other hand, it does give me kind of at a different level, at a cognitive level, it gives me a feel for the language that I think native speakers take for granted. They just grow up with it and then pick certain things up. Now, I want to read, this is from the New England Review, the latest issue. It's a poem by Su Cho. She spells her name S-U. I'm sorry, not How, Chow, C-H-O, Su Cho, I apologize. And she spells her name S-U. So she gets rid of the E in Su, which is interesting because it's clear that the E in Su is not pronounced. It's useless. You don't say Sui or Sue or Sue. It's just Su. And when you're not paying attention, that silent E is there and it doesn't matter. But to someone who's coming in from a different language, that is one of the things that would pop up. So she started calling herself Sue without an E. And this poem is called Abecedarian for ESL in West Lafayette, Indiana. ESL is English as a second language. So these are classes where kids that are coming from a different country get started into learning English as a second language. And an Abecedarian is a form that at the beginning of each line has a letter of the alphabet. So it would begin with A, second line begins with a B, C, D, E, etc., and it goes all the way to X, Y, Z. So each line begins with a different letter of the alphabet. It's kind of like a childish motif, like you're learning your ABCs. And it tends to get a little bit banal at times. And I think Sue really captures something in this poem about the experience of being a language broker, ESL classes, and so on. So anyway, this is, let me read the poem. It's Abecedarian for ESL in West Lafayette, Indiana. A is for apples, shipped fresh off the boat. At 2 p.m., we left math to go where children are taught differences between English and English at home. For example, Sun A, who named herself, grabbed blue pills from a plastic bag, held the medicine in her palm. Teachers called me in. Ibuprofen, I say. I am 7, just learned the word because Sonny sputtered Korean that they are painkillers. Look, English was my second language, but my tongue was new. Never had to teach me to curl my R's or how to say girl, blueberries, raspberries. In second grade, I played Peter Rabbit's Mother Rabbit. Still don't quite know how that happened or even remember what my lines were. Still, when the Chicago Field Museum unveiled Sue, the T-Rex, I was Sue, the dinosaur. Still exist, but I was kept there after proficiency. Who else could translate for the teachers, my parents, and Sonny's parents? X was for xylophone, X-rays, and now xenophobia. Yes, that's two on the nose, but things on your nose are hardest to see. Z is for zero, zigzagging between classrooms to say she has a fever, she misses home. I think it's a wonderful poem, and it captures like so much of that experience. The first one is kind of a poem about survivor's guilt that I wrote. It's called Confession. When we left Cuba, we left a lot of friends there. Most significantly for me, my grandfather and grandmother, whom I had grown up with in Cuba. And after trying to write to them and call, and it was very difficult to communicate it, it really became so painful to think of them that one of my coping mechanisms was just to kind of stop thinking about them. I just thought, you know, I'll never see them again. And then kind of unconsciously or subconsciously, I just detached myself from that. And much later, when I was in my 20s, I wrote this poem called Confession. Time is on the prowl, and the universe is nowhere near sated. Storm surge, meteor, black hole. The bones of life splinter and choke us. My grandparents fed an orphan who orphaned them and me, his son. I, too, left them at their door after forgetting our last hug. A revolution drowned them. I let myself believe when you're going under, you swim first for yourself. I was heating Campbell's in a can and counting Marlboros when ripples of their deaths found me. They'd each been dead for months. I cried, yes, until I didn't. And then I didn't. And that's a very harsh reality that, you know, life goes on. People, you lose people and you go on. You have to, in a way. And what it takes to do that. When I wrote this poem, I didn't have the knowledge to express what I was saying. I had the experience. I had the experience that I've been through. I left my grandparents, they had died, and I would cried and mourn and then moved on. So I had that experience, but I didn't have the knowledge yet to know, to say survivor's guilt. I didn't have the knowledge to say, this happens to a lot of people. It's not just me. This is a common human experience. How do I know about that? Because I've heard from other humans about it. In the meantime, how did I do that? Through language. So through language, I then became aware of what was happening to me and kind of making sense of my world. So in a way, I wonder, is poetry separate from knowledge outside of language, even though it exists inside it, or any kind of art? If we go back, right, remember the example of the apple falling and you experience that, and then you can actually explain and verbalize what's happening. Is poetry more experiential than knowledge, right? So somebody said, if you can paraphrase a poem, the poem's failed. If you can paraphrase what a poem is, then why have the poem? So a poem happens and it does things that are, in a way, beyond language. Right? If you think about it. It's interesting because Derrida said that the only art that is aware of its own limitations is poetry. And it is aware of its own limitations because it embraces them. This is in The Sovereign and the Beast. Derrida talks about how poetry is about the limitations of the art. And the limitations of the art is that it cannot justify or explain through language what it does. Because if it does that, then it has failed its purpose. So in a way, I wonder if specifically in poetry, but through other arts in other ways, when we experience art, we are experiencing a state that is outside of knowledge, and that it is our job as a reader to engage that field that is outside of knowledge, much like we would approach a second language, much like we would approach a language we don't quite understand, that we're not too familiar with. And that engages us in a series of activities that take us and enriches how we use language normally. So we use language to communicate, and then we have to experience this work of art and then use language to understand it and to try to deal with it. And doing that, it enriches not just our experience of the moment, but also our use of language. And so, and not just poetry, right? But it could be other art forms as well that you have to learn. You have to learn its codes, its meanings, how to approach it, how to decipher it, and what to do with it. And I think going back then to the second state that we started about, the timelessness in the moment. I thought about this and I tried to explain it in the following manner, that apparent conflict. That, let's see, that there are two basic modes of, when we talk about state of minds, there are basically two basic modes of operation. There's the experiential mode and the default mode. So experiential mode is essentially when you're learning something new, when you're having to pay attention to something and you're engaged because you're having to be in the moment. When you're watching a movie, you're watching the movie. When you're reading and you're engaged. And your mind is actually in the moment, processing and understanding things. And then there's the default mode, which is when you've done something 1,000 times and you're peeling potatoes and your mind goes off and you're thinking about, you're not concentrating on the peeling of the potatoes, you're just thinking, your mind is off, thinking about a baseball game you wanted to see, you know, your kids are late for this or that rehearsal or whatever. You're just, your mind is going off and it becomes its own thing. And a lot of Buddhist techniques, as well as Wittgenstein's idea and Viktor Frankl's ideas, engage the taking that mind that has gotten away from you and taking control of it, taking control of your thoughts. Yeah, learning, Eva says learning a second language is challenging task, as is mastering poetry, absolutely. Of course, I had to, being who I am, I had to pick writing poetry in a second language, just the most difficult thing there is to do in a second language. You know, why couldn't I go into fiction or something? But I tried, I just wasn't very good. And so that experiential moment happens when you're actually engaged. And I think poetry, art, having to learn a second language, having to operate in a second language takes you out of the ordinary. You're not having a conversation that is easy and familiar and you use the same terms over and over. You are now engaging something new, something difficult, something you have to master, and it brings you into that experiential mode, which is where you want to be. And I used to say, how could you be in the moment? You couldn't read. I mean, if you're in the moment, you couldn't read, because I thought being in the moment meant like your mind was blank and you didn't have any thoughts and you were just empty in your mind and you were conscious that you weren't thinking. And if a thought came, you would bat it, you know, you would gently push it away and you would concentrate on an empty mind. And slowly through reading and my own experience, I realized that no, that you can be present in the moment if you are doing something and you're aware that you're doing it. You are fully committed to reading. Your mind isn't racing. You're not daydreaming. You're not thinking about other things. You're not having to force yourself back to the text. You're actually having to commit. And I think that is one of the great skills that poetry teaches, is when you read a poem, you really have to engage in it. You have to think it through. You have to look at each word. You have to be present in that text. And that way you're in the moment. So in a way, you're in eternity, right? When you're in the moment, you're there, it's happening. And you have now become eternal in a sense, because you are not thinking about the past, the present, the future. You're just doing something. You're engaging in a task. And that may be the key to my question. How can you survive Auschwitz? How can you be a slave? And I think that experiential mode of being in the moment, of just being aware that you're alive, being aware that you're here, that this is happening. Well, contradictory, it may seem it may be better to just daydream and not think and like completely ignore reality, ignore life, and just not think and not be. You could argue then that would be eternally too. And I would counteract that both are necessary. The knowledge that you find only in language and the eternal moment are both necessary. So you have to be aware that you're in the moment, but you have to be able to tell yourself and know that. And that, I think, is what Wittgenstein means by being in the moment and being eternal. Like Borges. He says, being immortal is no big deal. Being immortal and knowing it, that's amazing. So being in the moment, anybody who's drunk or whatever, they're not thinking about anything, but being in the moment and knowing it, that I think is something that really allows you to explore and create things that normally you wouldn't have a chance to. And I wanted to end on a positive note. This is a very short poem. And I have 2 minutes, so I think we're okay, Jennifer. Good. Now, this poem is a true story. When we moved to Rochester, New York, and we were on welfare, we ate government cheese, we had, food stamps, and we lived in a housing project, basically. And it was a fairly bad area of town. It was the Hispanic, Latino, poor area of town. A lot of violence, a lot of drugs. And then the African-American neighborhood started about 2 blocks away. And that zone was a site of violence between African-American and Latino guys. So I saw people getting stabbed. I saw people shot. It was not the best, not many. I saw one person being stabbed. And I think just 2 people being shot, or maybe it might have been 3, but there weren't many. But when you're 13, 14, these things kind of become significant. So I got to a bike and I got to a Boy Scout journal, and I would bike out of town and go into the woods and try to identify tracks, try to see who was around, while I was learning English at that point. So my vocabulary wasn't huge. So this is called Using the Scout's Handbook While Learning English. Not yet a full animal, no longer fully a cub. Sunlight green on me through summer's high canopy. A stream mud-cheeked from last night's rain. From 3 decades later, I see myself, lean for my age, light boned as a hawk, fleeing a housing project, not so much life preserver as a hurricane's next island. But today, the tallest I've been and growing, I think I've come for animals. From their world, mine must seem both comically unstealthy and full of sudden excitement. But I see, as I still see, both the signs on the mud and the need to read them. Their tracks attest for the handbook. And it answers. A pair of raccoons, deer, and later what I want to be a bear, but it's just a dog. The known names besides the unknown. Muskrat, grouse, skunk. And I didn't yet know why I'll remember this day, when I asked and was answered, when the world spoke its persistent language, and I, with due care, understood. yes, I think the world made sense. I wish it did now. But any questions, any comments? So in Spanish, I think Borges is by far my biggest influence. I love his imagination, his ability to combine obscure philosophical concepts with very good stories, and how he makes the most impossible situations real. And his erudition, the ways he can bring in all kinds of allusions. In Spanish, you realize Borges, he uses words in Spanish that no one uses. They're part of the language, but nobody writes like that. He is hard to read, yes. And in Spanish, maybe in English it becomes a little easier to read Borges because the translator is doing a lot of the work for you. But in Spanish, he uses a difficult Spanish stuff. I think in English, let me think, because I've had so many influences in English. But if I had to pick, I would say Sylvia Plath is probably the most important poet that I've read, and I continue to read. Her mastery of form, like Elizabeth Bishop and others, her mastery of form and sound, like H.D., Hilda Doolittle, is amazing. And yet at the same time, she really was of the moment. When she was writing the Ariel poems in 1962, 1963, she was articulating and was able to articulate the problems that were happening to her right there, right now. Her identity as a woman, as a mother, her identity as a writer, as a woman writer. I've read her diaries several times, and it always struck me how aware she was of things. How she was able to put them in writing. She was able to put in language these things that she knew about class, wealth, writing, the politics of writing, things that I didn't learn, probably my 30s really, and didn't learn well till later. And I was always surprised at how well she was able to say things, to express what she knew. So I guess and her metaphors are beautiful. She's so imaginative. It just gives you something to shoot for. Sorry for my long answer, but that's that. Well, I am all over the internet. I have if you Google Andres Rojas poetry, Andres Rojas poetry or Andres Rojas poet, you should be able to find a lot of stuff. I have many poems published all over the place. Last year, I got my first chapbook out. It's called Looking for What Isn't There. It's through Paper Nautilus, and you can order it online. It's only $8. And I would ask that you buy it from them to help them support other poets. But basically, just Google Andres Rojas poetry or Andres Rojas poet, and you'll get a lot of stuff. You can read them online yourself as well. And I saw a question just from Dora. No. Early on, I started to write in Spanish, and I became, not early on, but as I was writing in English, which was my main language from the time I was 15, 16, I thought in English, dreamt in English. All my relationships outside the home were in English. My schooling was in English, learning was in English. So I started writing poetry in English. And after a while, I decided to go back to Spanish and see if I could work in Spanish. And I felt just clunky. It felt like a second language, strangely enough. It felt, the ear was there. I mean, I could hear the cadences and the rhythms, but language kind of betrayed me. I didn't have the vocabulary. So I went through high school and college learn all my theory, learn all the writing in English. So my vocabulary in Spanish is pretty limited to pretty basic stuff without a dictionary. So no, I never did write the same poem. And that might be an interesting exercise to do. I have translated from Spanish to English, which is in itself an interesting exercise. But thank you for the question and for being here, by the way. Yes, actually, we were the first issue of the Campus Voice. I was in the staff that put out the first few issues. At that time, I forget who was the editor-in-chief. I think Bill Cushing became editor later. Tammy Brown was editor-in-chief. Oh, Mark Dyckmiller was her first editor-in-chief. Mark Dyckmiller, who went to FSU and then became a journalist. The last I heard, he was writing for the Democrat. So yes, I did some features. Back then, this was in 1986, I believe, and the AIDS pandemic was a disaster. So I did a story on a local group that was helping AIDS patients. That was nominated for a statewide award, and we won. The paper won for that investigative story. Bill Cushing and I co-authored something else that also got nominated. So I was doing that. I always felt that we should, as a college paper, kind of deal with stuff that was happening nationally. And I also reviewed local bands. I interviewed, there used to be a show called The Metro on the National Public Radio Station. I forget his name. I interviewed him for that. And then I became a columnist. I conned people into thinking that I could be funny on a bi-weekly basis. And then I became columnist for the paper and had a lot of fun doing that. So I remember that very, very fondly. Kevin Bessner was our faculty advisor at that time. So yes, I was there. Yes, I would say at two levels. At one level, when you're beginning, you have to believe that you're a lot better than you are to actually be able to keep doing what you're doing. And as you get more and more experience, you have to start questioning how good you are. So in order to keep your quality up. So I would say, as you're starting, give yourself room to learn, room to make mistakes. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be close to perfect, but you're going to get there. And as you get more and more experience, make sure that you stay focused on your standards. Do the best you can. You did something good, don't sit on your laurels. Try to do more, better. Get better every single time. It's a journey. Like it's a slow journey from one stage to the other. And don't expect perfection, but expect improvement, consistent improvement, gradual improvement. You will get better. If you do it, if you continue doing it mindfully and paying attention to what you're doing, you will get better. And second, I would say it is very important to know the basic rules of grammar, just to be able to write a clear, declarative sentence in English and just nail it. And it doesn't take much. You can get a grammar book, revise it, look at the major things, comma splices, sentence fragments, few sentences, subject-verb agreement, noun-pronoun agreement, tense consistency, parallel structure. You get those things down, you understand exactly, what a dangling modifier is, and it makes your writing so much clearer and so much more powerful. And once you have those rules down, you'll have a very comfortable base from which to grow. So I would say definitely go out of your way early on to become as good a craft writer as you can. And it doesn't have to, you can write, if you write 2 pages a day consciously, that's like, 600 and something pages in a year. And you will get better. You will just get better if you keep up. And then don't give up, never give up. My motto is, it will not be for lack of trying. Don't give up. I think there's 2 poets that I think anybody writing from Cuba would know. Luis Lezama Lima, who was sort of a surrealist, Dadaist poet. He's best known for his work Paradiso, which is sort of a stream of consciousness, gay work that was heavily censored by the government because the Cuban government was very anti-homophobic, very anti-gay. But Elizama Lima, like Borges, uses language to perfection. Another poet that I love is Virgilio Piñera, another gay Cuban poet, who in the early 60s was writing to try to preserve a world prior to the revolution, which, while he sympathized with the revolution, until his eventual fallout with it, but while he sympathized with the revolution, he could see that the revolution was coming in and destroying a lot of the cultural richness that existed in Cuba, attacking the intellectual community, the writers community, and very much attacking the gay subculture. So he has this poem, which I love, Virgilio Piñera, which unfortunately has a terrible title. There are issues with him, racial issues. He was white, and there are feminist issues with him. He, as a gay man, didn't particularly think very highly of women, it seems like. But the poem is called The Great Whore. And the only thing that redeems it for me is that at the end of the poem, he's actually the great whore. He's actually talking about himself. I'm sorry he uses that term, but he's actually self-criticizing. And that's a poem. It's a long, rambling poem, sort of like if you imagine Howl, Ginsberg's Howl. It's a long, rambling poem going through what life in Havana for the gay subculture was like, and preserving it, keeping things in memory that we're going to be destroyed, and he sort of acts like a keeper of memory, and that aspect of his work, in his other work as well, fascinates me. His commitment to memorializing things that are vanishing. So yes, those two poets. Well, again, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. We're in a tough time. Things are difficult with COVID-19 and the administration, the current administration, and its handling of things. But I think that we've been through worse, and we've gotten through it. And don't give up. It will not be for lack of trying. You got to keep trying. And there's no guarantee of success, but if we don't try, nothing will happen. If we do try, something's bound to happen.